Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this fellow-led RSA event. Publishing forms one of the creative industries covered by the Media Creative Industries Culture and Heritage Network. And today we have the privilege of hearing Dr. Parag Khanna about his book, Move, and in a moment I'll refer to his previous books. This meeting is being recorded, so please bear that in mind when we reach the question and answer stage. Our speaker has been described elsewhere as a manager. Well, he is the manager and founding partner of Future Map. And he's been described in another webinar as a thinker, advisor, and catalyst, a visitor to 100 countries, spending much of the pandemic in Singapore. He holds a doctorate from LSE and has written, amongst other journals, for the FT and National Geographic. A variety of his books are obviously on Amazon and include Second World in 2008, Connectography in 2020, and this book, Move, published last October, in which he looks at the vision of mankind's next phase of civilization, hoping that it will be mobile and sustainable. There are so many things in the book that struck me, and no doubt they will you as you listen to him. So do please think up your questions for the session. After he has spoken, excuse me, 3 people who you can see if you're on gallery view will make a quick response to his presentation and then share 1 or 2 questions with him. And we shall after that take questions from the audience. The 3 panel members are Dr. Sarah Kayambi of Migration Policy Scotland, which is a new independent think tank. She's an expert in UK migration policy, and perhaps it's worth saying that MPS was set up in 2020 after a scoping project the year before. She has previously worked for think tanks in Edinburgh, London, and Brussels, wrote Room for Manoeuvre in 2009, a guide for COSLA in 2012, and reports for example, IPPR. And she holds a PhD in law and social theory from London. Professor David Bell, very well known across the UK, but most notably in Scotland, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and has held a chair in economics at Stirling since 1990. He's been a specialist advisor to committees in the House of Lords, is a special advisor to the David Hume Institute, and like most of our speakers, has a very lengthy biography to be found on the web. And he's a very frequent respondent to the media. And I have the privilege of knowing him through the DHI. Professor Oscar Guardiola Rivera is at Birkbeck College, the University of London, where he's Professor of Human Rights and Political Philosophy. His research interests include peacemaking, mediation, and conflict resolution. He also is a regular media collaborator with the BBC, BBC World Service, Guardian, and Independent. But more interestingly also, he has been an aide to the Colombian Congress and a consultant to the UN in South America. So I think there will be very different perspectives to be brought to bear after Dr. Khanna's presentation, which, if I may, I would now like to ask you to present.
Absolutely, thank you so much, and I'm honored and delighted to join all of you. And thank you for that generous introduction. I'm already looking forward to this illustrious panel afterwards that will really dive into the implications of global arguments about human geography that I want to present today, and apply them, very much to our present context in the UK and the British Isles, and perhaps Europe more broadly. I'll start by setting the scene in terms of the global context and the broader thesis of the book. So I'll share my screen here and hope that everyone can see it. And we'll jump right in. I'll try to keep my remarks to just 15 minutes if I can. Very often when we talk about the future of human geography, when we talk about migration in particular as a subset of that, we focus on one driver or the other. For example, people moving due to labor shortages and demographic imbalances more generally, particularly in northern OECD countries, and people being invited as a stopgap measure, as a temporary measure. Think of the guest workers from Turkey into Germany, or Latin Americans and Asians in the United States. It always turns out to be something of a longer duration, if not a permanent, resettlement of populations. And today, those demographic imbalances are as acute as ever in terms of the age structure in societies, the mismatch between old and young, the dependency ratio, as it's known, and the mismatch between old and young internationally as well. Then we also have political upheavals, whether they be civil wars or international conflicts. These I would characterize as, again, political upheavals, and these are not something that suddenly, or they're not suddenly being resolved instantly by any stretch of the imagination. We have the collapse of Syria, Afghanistan, to take just a couple of contemporary examples that drive people to seek to relocate. There's the economic dislocations that arise due to financial crises or other kinds of economic events. Even I would add technological disruptions right in there as part and parcel of it. It could be globalization of labor that suddenly forces people to relocate if their factories are closed. Or it could be automation, artificial intelligence that leads to people being displaced and needing to move elsewhere in search of work. It could also be Zoom and remote work and work from home policies that have allowed for a whole new class of digital nomads to relocate around the world wherever they may seek to be. And then, of course, there's climate change, which is the original sort of driver or driving force behind where the human species has come to settle, primarily between 20 and 30 degrees north latitude. And of course, climate change is accelerating again today. But we don't get to pick just one reason why people move and the motivations behind migration, whether it's internal or international. It's all of these at the same time. And in many ways, these forces are as acute, as present, as profound as ever before. And all of them, as I try to illustrate here, also are enabled to some degree by the growing reality of our connectivity. Now, we live in a world of more borders than ever before, but we also live in a world of more connections than ever before. Physical, transportation, energy, communication systems that do enable mobility of people, even if that's not its original intent. And so all of that together leads to, the fact that the driving forces behind a significant shift in our human geography in the years ahead are so powerful today, that leads me to believe that we are entering a world of accelerated mobility of humankind. So what I want to do in these brief remarks is talk about who is doing the moving and where they're moving to. So first, let's start with the who. We live at a very interesting time in the global demographic curve, because whereas 15 or 20 years ago, many people forecast a world population that would continue to grow towards 13, 14, some even thought 15 billion people, that's not the case anymore. Prior to the pandemic, the sort of most up-to-date forecasts had put this peak humanity number at about 11 billion people. And that was before the baby bust of the COVID pandemic. And I believe that it overestimated our likely point of demographic plateau for other reasons as well. It could well be that the world population never actually even reaches 10 billion people, which means that most of the people who will ever live are actually alive today, and that there is going to be a significant, and again, because of the COVID baby bust, a real correction in those forecasts coming out of the pandemic. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But overall, we've seen fertility decline very significantly, even in developing countries. We all know that China's population has effectively reached its peak. And even as they've tried to shift from the one-child policy to the two-child policy, and the two-child policy to the three-child policy, they haven't really had any takers even for the two-child policy. India's fertility has declined significantly, and even in Africa, fertility is dropping quickly. And of course, much of the Northern Hemisphere has already reached this peak humanity in the sense that absent immigration, we are already at sub-replacement fertility levels in most OECD countries, especially countries like Japan and Korea, for example. And the United States is pretty much there as well. So we face is a pretty significant, again, geographical imbalance in the location of generations, older people in the North, younger people in the South, so to speak. And that's a very awkward geographical structure for our demographics, in addition to the fact that we're in this unique moment of peak humanity that very few people, as recently, again, as 10, 15 years ago, really thought would occur anytime soon. And indeed, it may well be at hand in the next decade and a half or so. And I think that has all sorts of implications for countries' immigration policies. They realize that rather than putting up walls and borders and barriers and so forth for a variety of reasons, they actually need to actively recruit and compete for the next generation of taxpayers, construction workers, renters, homeowners, caregivers, whatever the case may be. That may sound all too pragmatic, given contemporary European political dynamics, but I believe there are quite a few examples out there of places that are seeing the writing on the wall demographically and fiscally, and starting to make modifications in their immigration policies accordingly. Let's talk a little bit about who we mean when we actually talk about we the people, we the world. And I think that we have this de facto, obviously geographically parochial, sort of view on who speaks for the world and who represents humanity, and who are those people that we are referring to when we use the first person plural, we. I think very often we think, well, that's us. It's a two-parent, two-income, two-child households living in suburbia. But it seems to me that the more you look at the rump of the global population, which is still more young than old, what you actually have is that the kind of median human being, if there is such a thing, is not like the we that I just described. It's actually a person who is young, who's under the age of 40, who is unmarried, who has no children, who is financially struggling, and who's certainly not a homeowner, but at best renting some kind of nominal tenement in a developing country, most likely in a city, large or small. That's a sort of median human being in the world today. What I've tried to do in this book is to kind of construct a narrative around the future geography of where those people today will be over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, based upon their circumstances and their values. After all, if you're going to do future casting, you have to talk about the people who will inhabit the future. The people who will inhabit the future are the people who are under the age of 40 today, over the next couple of decades. And so it forces us to put ourselves in their skin, and to view the world the way they do, which, based upon a lot of surveys and data that we have, is more generational than it is national, more horizontal than vertical, you might say. And a generation that almost universally subscribes, according to, again, many, many surveys, to the values of connectivity, sustainability, and mobility, things that they believe really are human rights. Now, why would they believe, let me just go back to this point. Why should we believe that this young generation that constitutes more than 50% of the world population and 100% of the future world population, why will they behave differently than us, those who are older, those, let's say, if you're alumnus of the 1968 generation, and you think about the process by which radicalism, or again, sort of cultural or countercultural movements were ultimately subdued through the forces of the welfare state, home ownership, and having children. Well, if you're dealing with a group of a wide generation of people, a swath of people who don't have children, who don't own property, who are financially insecure, what reason is there to believe that they will simply be tamed and domesticated in the way that the OECD populations were in the post-war decades? I don't see that as a necessary repeat of history. I think instead you could have a continuation of what I've called the global underclass revolt, continuing and unfolding across time, even as the younger generation becomes older. And of course, we see manifestations of that, particularly in liberal democratic Western societies today. Now let's talk about, again, if I'm talking about 3 or 4 billion, young people across the world and their desire to either change their political systems from within or to relocate to societies that they find more welcoming on the basis, again, of the fact that there are the demographic imbalances, the political upheavals, the economic dislocation, the technological disruption, and climate change. What can we imagine about the future of human geography, particularly as it applies to the most mobile generation in human history, this childless, assetless generation of billions of young people? Well, I can't give definitive answers, so instead I made scenarios. And I crafted these sort of 4 scenarios. And the thing about scenarios is that they have to have an element of groundedness in today's reality. These are not science fiction. They are actually, if you read these scenarios, they could apply to places today in different parts of the world, or also describe the world of 2050. The question really is when or where at the same time, or indeed they are true today in different places at the same time. So, for example, regional fortresses is a scenario that I find quite analogous to today's world. The wealthier regions of the Northern Hemisphere are focused more on their own their own adaptation to climate change, with a lower appetite for mass migration. Hence, the scenarios are crafted along these axes of sustainability versus migration. Many parts of the world you would characterize as being in these lower quadrants of the new Middle Ages and barbarians at the gate, which you have some mix of efforts at adaptation, but much more emphasis on a de facto self-reliance. You even have elements of resource wars and land grabs and the new geopolitics of environmental resource scarcity. So 3 of the 4 scenarios are not particularly positive. And again, you can see how this plays out when you look at European politics today, when you look at the Mediterranean Sea, which in the media is referred to as a graveyard for migrants. The same thing is true in the U.S. on the U.S.-Mexico border, and so on. And if you look at the tensions between countries over river systems, you can see this in the Upper Nile, you can see it in the Middle East elsewhere, you can see it certainly in the Mekong River, and so forth. So only one of the 4 scenarios that I've crafted is a positive one, what I call Northern Lights. And here too, there is some basis in reality. If you look at a country like Canada, for example, which happens to be the single most generous country in the world in terms of the number of people that it absorbs, net new permanent residents from around the world, as a percentage of its own population. The Canadian population literally grows by more than 1% every year, voluntarily, strategically. In fact, in Canada, immigration policy is their economic policy, and there's a broad consensus in support of it. So this is by no means a pipe dream. It's actually Canada today. You might even say it's Germany today, not as sort of, willingly or voluntarily, more involuntarily, but now grudgingly accepting its role as a recipient of ever more migrants, whether they're political refugees or for other reasons. That's not going to grow unabated, of course, by any means. But there is evidence that you could imagine a world where we have all the technological tools at our disposal to relocate populations and to do so without necessarily exacerbating our environmental footprint. But again, one can advocate for northern lights, but in scenario planning, you have to accept that to some degree, all of these will be true and continue to be true in different parts of the world. And it is incumbent upon us to shape and steer the future in whichever direction we choose. Now, we've grown accustomed to certain patterns of migration over the last several decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. Most migration has been intra-regional, within regions, or within hemispheres, if you think about the Western Hemisphere. But Africans within Africa, citizens of the former Soviet republics within that post-Soviet space, Asians within Asia, South Asians to the Gulf countries, Europeans within Europe, and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily, that just doesn't necessarily sustain itself indefinitely when you think about all of the driving forces shaping our future human geography, particularly climate change. So if you take the present distribution of the world population, which is this, about 8 billion pixels, right, on this map, and you take into account the IPCC forecasts around the changing suitability of geographies for human habitation, you get an image like this. And this is not an artistic rendering, this is scientific projection. And red zones are those that are becoming less suitable for human life as temperatures rise 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. Green zones are becoming more sort of habitable as time goes on. Now, note again the perverse fact that most of the world's young, the aging populations, the aging societies are those, and aging and shrinking populations occupy the geographies that are becoming more livable over time, whereas most of the world's young people reside in countries that are becoming less and less habitable. But of course, we don't live in a borderless world by any stretch of the imagination. There's immense political and geographical and other barriers to resorting that mismatch between old and young in a climate-stressed world. And we don't have any roadmap for how we would rectify those imbalances. We live in a world of strict national sovereignty. At the COP26 summit, there was finally a bit more talk about climate adaptation, not just climate mitigation, but certainly very little, if any, talk about mass population resettlement. That's not the kind of thing that sovereign governments talk about when sovereign governments get together at an international summit. I would submit that of all the common protocols and norms and conventions that we will ratify in the world, the last one that will ever happen, if ever, and it's more likely than not to never, ever happen, is to have a binding global accord enabling the free movement of people across borders. That is, in fact, the very last remaining vestige of sovereignty that no government would ever sacrifice, which is to say the ability to prevent the movement of people across their borders. So it is that sacrosanct principle that clashes with the vision of Northern Lights, or the scenario that I'm putting forward here. And if we think about what it would take, what we would need to do to reorganize the distribution of people in the world from climate vulnerable and climate stressed towards climate resilient and habitable areas. The places that I call climate oases, or others call climate havens. And this is more stylized, but each of these stars, and quite frankly, a whole bunch more that I don't depict, reflect different chapters of the book, where I kind of take you through what the not only environmental characteristics are of a place in terms of its suitability for habitation, but the politics, the economics, the cultural attributes and variables and things we have to think about over time in terms of whether or not these places are capable of absorbing greater populations. So I talk about, of course, Canada and parts of the northern United States, quite a few parts of Europe, Central Asia, and various zones within East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So that's the kind of geographical part. Now we can talk very briefly, and this will probably be the bulk of our discussion, I'm sure, is really going to be about how do we manage the inevitable mass migrations. And the one thing is to kind of step back and take a big picture view over the sweep of centuries, which is to say that as the world population has grown, as migration has increased from merely millions within a century to tens of millions to hundreds of millions in the 20th century, and perhaps even over 1 billion people in the 21st century, let us remember that actually this is not a new story. Sometimes when I talk about mass migration these days, people say, oh my goodness, this is unprecedented. I would say it's not even remotely unprecedented. In fact, to move is human. Migration is the most fundamental attribute of being a human being. Mobility has been our past, our present, our future. We have been a mobile species for more than 100,000 years, in fact. And in recent centuries, while we have done an atrocious job at maintaining international peace and stability, at maintaining egalitarian, economic systems, and being good stewards of the environment, been terrible at those things, but we've been phenomenal at absorbing mass migrations, right? That is precisely why Western societies have the complexions that we have today. The largely peaceful absorption of hundreds and hundreds of millions of migrants iteratively through waves and ebbs and flows over the recent centuries. So there's nothing new whatsoever about mass migrations, nor is it an unprecedented task to manage them. In fact, I dare say it's the one thing that we are the best at as a collective civilization without even having to have an international, supranational sort of protocol or norm for it. And that's a very good thing. And we have to remind ourselves that this is how we became who we are and how we became the successful, innovative, dynamic, thriving societies that we are today. So the final couple of points are around the kind of micro politics of this and what is different. Now, we do know, I mentioned earlier, the shifting generational values, and we do know that when we talk about strong nationalist sentiment, populism, xenophobia, there is a generational gap in these views. It's not universally as wide as it is in some countries, but it's really very, very clear. And in the book, I talk about the failures of populist governments to reflect the actual will of the people or to deliver anything remotely resembling good governance. I won't, as a guest in the United Kingdom today, I'm not going to cast excessive aspersions on the present situation. I'll allow those who hold British passports to do that. But I will say that I have a chapter on the UK in the book, but more broadly, I look at conscription, among other things. It's very interesting to talk about how in the last few years, particularly since Brexit and Trump, it's been the conventional wisdom that we live in a world in which populist, xenophobic nationalism dominates Western politics, and that national identity is resurgent. And so I thought, well, let's put that to the test, especially among young people. What would be the single best litmus test of whether young people are nationalistic beyond just surveys? Aha, let's look at conscription. So I looked, first of all, at the complete disappearance of conscription, the abolition of conscription based upon public demand and other sort of political forces in many countries. That alone speaks for itself. In the countries that have conscription, in East and West, whether it's Korea or Turkey, Russia, and elsewhere, what I've found is that nationalism really winds up looking like quite a joke. Because the rite of passage for pretty much every single young man in any country with conscription today is to buy their way out as quickly as humanly possible. Right? The first bribe that any young Turkish man, well, probably not the first, but the most expensive bribe that they save up years for is to get out of conscription. Right? So that to me doesn't tell a story of coherent, uniform nationalism in societies. So I go to great lengths to point out the generational differences in attitudes towards national identity. And again, to reinforce the point that the younger generation thinks more horizontally than vertically. And I echo and endorse some of the terminology and some of the policy recommendations of Philippe Legrand here in London, who runs Open. And he talks about some of the important policy steps that can be taken to depoliticize migration, to focus on skills that are necessary in society, to bridge those labor shortages, to focus on, again, language that's more neutral, to focus on assimilation policies from education, vocational training to language adoption, and so forth. Most of all, I make a plea that immigration policy be based on supply and demand rather than nationalism and populism. That would help to avoid some of the, being caught off guard the way the UK has been, for example, with nursing shortages and trucker shortages and these kinds of things. So finally, I'll just wrap up, pan back to the big picture. Given the crises that we face collectively, especially climate change, I find, and the demographic plateau and demise that stands before us, if you share with me the mission to preserve the number of human beings that are alive in the world and to achieve a more utilitarian outcome for those of us that remain alive and the smaller and smaller generations that are coming after us. In other words, to achieve a more sensible human geography and a fairer world for those 8 or 9 billion people that will exist in the coming decades, you will do either one of two things. You will either support the movement of people to geographies of resources, or you will support the shift or the transfer of technologies to the places that need them. And that's it, one of those two things. Those are, I believe, the two most valuable and noble actions that we can undertake. We can support the idea that mobility is a human right, even if it remains circumscribed by political sovereignty, and look more at some of the conventions that countries can be party to in some of the skills partnerships and other kinds of, and we could obviously craft better international legal guidance around how to deal with climate refugees than we have today. We can focus more on the better division of labor in terms of how absorbing migration, mass migration, can help to stimulate economies, but to do so in a sustainable fashion. And ultimately, achieve what I call civilization 3.0, which is not the nomadic and agricultural 1.0 model that characterized humanity for the majority of our history, not the industrial and sedentary reality that many of us find ourselves in today, but rather a world in which mobility is enabled, but we do so sustainably in the interest of the preservation of humankind, as it were. So that's the agenda that I set forth in this book, and that's just a brief summary of the arguments. And I look forward to now getting into the discussion with all of you. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. And the floor is back to Ms. Packard. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I've thought of 3 immediate questions, but before any of that, I would like to ask perhaps Sarah first, and then Oscar, and then David, to make their first responses. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, Parag, for this opportunity and for the book, which I very much enjoyed. I thought it was a good romp through the potential futures and the role that migration will play in that. I thought I would restrict my comments. I try to restrict my focus onto what the area of my expertise, which is migration policy, and just briefly. Just to say, so migration policy, Scotland's purpose is to promote a constructive approach to migration. And I found Dr. Khanna's book helps me with that in 2 ways. One is it provided a nice prompt to kind of expand my focus away from the UK and from Scotland onto a wider global canvas. And I often find that very helpful. And secondly, it provided a perspective that highlights the need for better collective decision-making on migration. And I'll take that last one first. And in my view, this is actually the key value of this kind of forecasting, foresight type work, is not in the accuracy or otherwise of its conclusions, but rather in the way this kind of work helps open up our thinking to new types of possibilities, and stimulates the pulling that into how we think about our planning and our policy making. And I would just say, so progress towards, Parag has touched on this, progress towards better global governance of migration is halting, to say the least. And in my view, much of the obstacle there lies in states and their publics taking too narrow or too fixed a view of where their interests lie. And I think books like this can help remind us not only of the complexity of global migration as it currently stands, but also that this is accelerating and likely to change much more significantly in future, particularly in response to climate change and in response to demographic factors. And I hope that books like this provide policymakers and others with a kind of a, what lawyers, so I did my PhD on refugee law, so lawyers call a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. So where you put your own self-interest to one side. And I think it can create that by having states being less invested in seeing themselves as either a sending or receiving country of migration, and being much more alive to the possibility that while they might be in one of those two camps at the moment, that could change in the future, and that therefore developing a more equitable system is in everybody's interest long term. But on my first point on the global focus, I think in relation to Scotland, the consideration of the role migration plays in terms of mitigating the impacts of population aging is centre stage in a way that we don't often see at UK level, but is starting to feel quite familiar in Scotland. Scotland has more advanced population challenges, with migration playing a crucial role in preventing population decline in Scotland. Just to drive that home, current projections under the new immigration system show Scotland's population falling while England's continues to grow. And that's quite a stark divergence in my view. So I was particularly interested to see, the examples that you listed in your book, whether it's about the US's Rust Belt or efforts to repopulate Southern Europe. And I think there's a lot to be gained by transferring what we can learn from these experiences. At the same time, I also want to caution against the idea that migration alone is the panacea here. Migrants are subject to the same drivers that contribute to depopulation in the first place. And solutions are not as simple as kind of add people and stir, if you will. But I am very keen on having these more complex conversations about the role migration can play in addressing today's and tomorrow's challenges, and understanding what it is that we need migration to do and how we might go about trying to get it to do that. And I think that's really urgently needed instead of this reductive, are you for or against migration discussion, which currently dominates both public and political debate in the UK and further afield. So I find that very encouraging, and I think there really is a need for complexity and nuance. But that's very difficult to do. And I did find Move as a book felt rather split between what I sometimes think of as the two faces of migration. There's the huddled masses and the global elites. And I don't think that's surprising. Migrants tend to cluster at different extremes of the income scale. So you are talking about a group of people who have more polarized experiences as a group than most groups. And I felt a bit wary about overly celebrating mobility or of overstating the role that it currently plays. It's still just 3.4%, of which elite migration of the you have MBA will travel is an even smaller proportion. So I think it's good to see that migration offers benefits, but I want to caution about how we see. I think people migrate in pursuit of those benefits, but migration also carries risks. And now and in the past, people have found their ability to weigh up those costs and benefits can fall short. I think to make good policy in this area, we really need to try and weigh up these experiences more in their completeness, in their fullness. And that's something that's very hard to do, and something that gets even harder in the very polarized debates that we have about this, that are just about being for or against, or should there be more migration or less, and not enough about what is it that we need migration to do, and how can we have a fuller discussion of that. I agree that the acceleration of migration is a phenomenon. And it's one that we expect to see significant changes of, but in fact is driving that, and that we really do need to find better ways to integrate migration and migrants into the ways that we think through our social and political lives. And I really appreciated the effort of this book to initiate that kind of discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Could we move now swiftly to Oscar and then David?
Thank you very much. And
I'm mindful of timing.
Sure, of course. Many moons ago, I had the wonderful opportunity of sharing a stage with Parag in the context of a debate as to whether the Americas or China would be showing to the rest of the world an image of their own future. And back then, we defended the first position. I think that this magnificent book confirms on the basis of clear evidence the fact that the Americas do still have a key role to play in the realization of future trends. And it is from that perspective, as an Americanist, as a Latin Americanist, that I hope you take my very brief comments. The first one is just to salute Parag for having written a key book to understand the challenges of this century. The argument, as you heard, is deceptively simple. The 21st century will be the century of massive movements of peoples. But having said that, as Parag just told us, that has been the case throughout history. And indeed, we should be careful, as we just heard, not to overestimate the percentages, but rather to emphasize the fact that as David Graeber and David Wengrow put it together in another great book published late last year, the right to walk away, to move, is both primordial and a key to the future. In that respect, let me say just three things very quickly. The first one is that something that interested me a lot about this book is that it told us a story about migration, not only from the perspective of migration across borders, which tends to dominate our perspectives nowadays, and in fact invited us to leave behind that perspective behind which lurks both 19th century aggression and sovereignism, but rather to look at movement across borders and within borders, with chapters on how the movements of peoples would take place within the borders of the United States and or North America seemed to me of particular importance. And this leads me to the second commentary. Parag speaks of the need to reinvent what he calls, in the case of the Americas, but that can be extended also to Europe, a new continentalism. And it would entail abandoning, leaving behind, freeing ourselves from the familiar attitudes and habits that the sovereignist and nationalistic strands of the 19th century have left behind, even after their demise as an acceptable political philosophy. And here comes my third and final comment, which is also a provocation, a bit of a provocation to him. Precisely because of that, because of the need to reinvent continentalism, I found it at the very least paradoxical that in order to communicate his call to reinvent political ideas, institutions, and continental relations in the sense of a strategic regionalism or continentalism, Parag decided to use, in the case of the Americas, a metaphor as unfortunate as that of manifest destiny. As the listeners might suppose, if you ask any person of color in the United States, and of course, those of us who were born and know the history, the more or less recent history of the Americas south of the border of the Rio Grande, or Rio Bravo for us Latin Americans, it would be impossible to separate manifest destiny as an idea from its more ideological elements and its historical connections with racism, the extermination of indigenous peoples, and the wars of expansion in the hemisphere, insofar as they informed the foreign policy and the internal policy that allowed the former 13 colonies to annex Oregon, Texas, California, New Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Panama, and so on, and to hide from itself and others the resulting empire and imperialism that has cast such a long shadow over the late 20th and early 21st century history of the Americas. In that respect, Parag would like to answer a question, another deceptively simple question: how to disassemble the hidden empire of the United States, how to decolonize the Americas, because it wouldn't be possible to reinvent continentalism without purging our institutions from their addiction to political theologies such as manifest destiny, precisely at a moment in which Trumpism and other derivative fascisms and racisms in the rest of the continent, in the Americas, but also here in Europe, are on the rise. This is not some kind of wokeist argument, but rather it has to do with the demographic element that Parag so clearly analyzes for us. The demographic trends that Parag refers to entail, in the case of the Americas, and we could extend it to Europe, to take into account that, to speak solely of the United States, the white majority, which is the protagonist and the political subject implicit in manifest destiny ideology, would no longer be the majority after 2040, if not before.
Thank you very much.
Given that, it would be very, very possible that the process might not be as gradual and pacific as we would like to. Newer alliances will be necessary, and who knows, they might be revolutionary. Thanks indeed, Parag, for a wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Now, last but not least, David, and I'm hoping that you're going to maybe mention things like the implications for infrastructure and the delivery of public service and things like food and cybersecurity and all of that. Just, you're on mute, David. And then we'll get to some questions with the audience.
Okay, is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Parag. That was very stimulating discussion, and following from your book, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I had a really unfortunate thought come into my head at the start of the lecture, which was Mrs. May's quote: "If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere," which was closely associated with our debate over Brexit in the last few years, and I'm sure you'll be aware of that. I guess, well, I was actually involved in a discussion yesterday where specialists in social care were discussing from all over the world shortage of care workers, and trying to figure out where on earth these people are going to come from, because one country after another was saying we cannot find care workers. It's not just a British problem, but the problem of national boundaries seems to be one that in respect of certain occupations, countries are failing to deal with. I've also actually been writing an article for the Herald recently about migration in Scotland, and it is interesting, you know, your view that countries adapt, and Scotland is one country that really has adapted, in the sense that it it lost hundreds of thousands of people over the 19th and 20th century to other parts of the world. And then in the last 20 years, has actually received quite a lot of migrants mainly from. Sarah said it actually is now facing a bit of well, it's not necessarily a crisis, but its experience is going to be different from other parts of the UK, in that its population is expected to fall over the next 20 years or so. That's based on a very modest assumption, you know.
You're breaking up a little bit, David.
Of population, overseas migration of around 10 million. Can you hear me now?
It's just.
Okay. Parag's got me. Okay. I guess the point is that relatively slow population growth will put pressure on our public services going forward. And Parag mentioned Canada as an exemplar of a good migration policy. And of course, the provinces within Canada have their own separate migration policies that they can, to some extent, vary the national approach to immigration. The Scottish government has been refused on 2 or 3 occasions any say in migration policy within the UK. I guess, I mean, for me as an economist, a real question about some of the really quite dramatic changes that Parag was talking about is what are the incentives? How do markets have to change? For example, how the housing market, which is a huge barrier to migration in some parts of the world, in some megacities in particular, how do these things have to change to enable the large-scale migration that Parag was talking about? Because ultimately the costs and benefits of migration, those making the individual decision have to be in their interest to be making the kind of move that Parag was talking about, or it's simply not going to happen. I'm aware of times and possibly my signal breaking down, so I won't go on further than that.
Thank you very much. Hang on. Oh, sorry. There seem to me 2 very important things. If Tony Blair ever said education, 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 this seems to me to have 2 A's that need maybe adaptations and assimilation, and actually facing up to the reality of the global situation. I'm now going to ask if people in the audience want to ask a question, and if you could please show your faces and put up your hand, because I'm going to take questions by raising of hands. So I just need to see if anybody's got a hand up. Nobody has at the moment. Could I just ask what?
And just interrupt, Roger's put his hand up.
Oh, good. Who is Roger? And could they please show their face and ask the question?
Yeah, who is Roger? I don't know. I am Roger. I think the thing that's interesting to me is it's sort of a almost not exactly a philosophical overview which is being presented, but I'm really wondering how we facilitate the migration in the future. I mean, we're going to have a situation, you talked about climate change, where rising sea levels are going to make parts of places like Bangladesh uninhabitable. That's very large numbers of people. I mean, what sort of practical policies can we adopt to facilitate that without causing social unrest?
Parag.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just thank the panelists for their very, very astute and illuminating comments and critiques and recommendations and augmentation of the argument. It's really very, very gratifying to receive that feedback and to be educated, by your insights based upon your expertise. Because to me, as you all know, writing a book can be a very solitary exercise. Even if it involves interviewing lots and lots of people, you still have to retreat into your inner world and try and synthesize all of the ideas and experiences and observations. And so this is, to me, just the early phase, at least of my participation in what I hope is going to become a much more global dialogue around these, very extreme scenarios that lie ahead. So I'm really gratified that you all feel that there's sufficient common ground in our perspectives, that we really can share aspects of this agenda as it applies locally. So thank you really so much. On the question about Bangladesh as a particular example of this almost universal phenomenon of large-scale climate-related migration, as a practical matter, there is the gravity of geography, which is to say that most people in South Asia who need to relocate are going to remain in South Asia to some degree. One of the things I've looked at is how one of the largest mass migrations of the last several decades, as everyone knows, has been Chinese people moving from the countryside to coastal cities. Well, actually, the second largest mass migration of the last decades has been Indians also moving into urban areas, and in particular, the movement of Indians from north to south in search of better economic prospects, job opportunities, and so forth. And for those who know, even from at a cursory level, in India in particular, there's very significant civilizational differences between North and South Indians. I, for example, am a Punjabi, whereas and therefore have very little in common ethnically, certainly zero linguistically, with Tamils and the people of Kerala and other regions. When I travel there, they look at me like I'm Russian, and so there's actually been, and there are 2 points there. One is that actually some of the largest migrations in the world are domestic, and I failed to make that point at the beginning, but this is a book about all relocations of people, whether or not they cross borders, because most people will never leave the country in which they were born. And it's a reminder, going back to Sarah's point about what a low percentage of the total world population is migrants, though bearing in mind that the world population is much larger, therefore the number is still very, very significant today and growing. So, as a practical matter for climate refugees, whether they are from Bangladesh or elsewhere, I specifically deal with this situation in the book, and I talk about Bangladeshis moving north within Bangladesh, but also moving east and northeast into Myanmar, because Myanmar is a much more climate propitious country than Bangladesh. Right now, ironically, of course, you have Myanmar pushing the Rohingya ethnic Bengali Muslims into Bangladesh, where that's really one of the worst, sort of climate political refugee situations in the entire world. But again, ironically, as a result of climate change, a far larger number of Bangladeshis may wind up moving in the other direction. So for each and every instance that you can think of where there is an acute environmental, sort of destabilization and need for resettlement, there is also, in all likelihood, a somewhat proximate geography that will be the natural ecosystem that will be, let's say, overrun would be the unfortunate way of characterizing it by those people. And the larger one that I look at, and I'm sorry, I don't go on longer than just a minute, but I look at Eastern Anatolia, which is to say the highlands of Eastern Turkey, which are the location of the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which are the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years. And I point out that this is a verdant, livable, incredibly beautiful, geography, very fertile. in eastern Turkey that has been depopulating the entire rump of eastern Anatolia. Is a huge space on the planet that is less and less people. Meanwhile, immediately to the south, you have Syria, you have Iraq, you have Iran, 3 countries, and not to mention further, just adjacent, you have Lebanon, you have Jordan, and so forth. Countries that are being massively destabilized by climate change. Drought already played a role in the Syrian civil war. The most scorching temperatures on the planet are recorded in Iran and Kuwait and elsewhere. And those just share there's just one barbed wire fence, right? If that, separating all of these people, more than 100 million people in these perhaps irrevocably climate stressed regions from a beautiful, livable geography in Eastern Turkey. Now, again, I will challenge any one of the dozens of people on this webinar to tell me with a straight face that in the year 2050, that beautiful geography of Eastern Anatolia will not be populated by Arabs and Persians. Please tell me that with a straight face, right? And I don't think anyone would do that. So we will get from here to there, one way or the other. We will either get there through foresight and planning and incentives to help to shape Turkish policy to be a very different policy, of course, than it is today, and the same applies to Russia. So we will either get there through foresight and pragmatism and engagement and incentives and adjustments, or we'll get there violently, right? And through destabilizing kinds of unplanned mass migrations. But we will get there, make absolutely no mistake about it, because it is the story of the human species to migrate as a result of climate change and other forces in search of stability. That is our survival instinct, fight or flight.
So how do we avoid the violence? How do governments practically manage it so that we don't have violence?
Well, as I mentioned, briefly, we have been doing it for centuries. We've been doing it extremely well. It depends on which country, but the United States has not had mass violence as a result of being the ultimate destination for migrations over the past 200 years. Nothing of the sort. But of course, that's a Western society. If we're talking about Russia, we're talking about Turkey, if you look at other places, of course, it could turn out very differently. But I actually see some positive trends on the ground, even if they're not numerically impressive. If you look at Russia today, and I've spent a lot of time in Central Asia and Siberia, and I see growing Asian populations, and I talk to officials, administrators, mayors, governors, and they all say, we need more migrants. We need more construction workers. We need more farmers. We need more students, because Russia is one of the most rapidly depopulating countries in the world that also, again, perversely happens to be the single largest country in the world by geography. And what you hear from the Kremlin, which surely shapes what we think Russia thinks, right? We tend to superimpose, anthropomorphize, Vladimir Putin's xenophobia and conflate that with Russians' view of their own ethnicity and their capacity to import and absorb more migrants. But that's not true. There are surveys that have been done very recently in the last 1 year of Russians showing changing and positive attitudes towards migration. There's shifts in Russian policy around literally seeking to incentivize more people from former Soviet republics to come and work in Russia. There's efforts to attract Indian farmers and do skills-based partnerships there, and to recruit construction workers to do Belt and Road projects. And even as one head of a university told me in Siberia, in Krasnoyarsk, he said, we should start teaching in English, because that way we can compete for Asian students who would otherwise go to the Gulf countries or to Europe. That's actually happening right now. And you will not hear any of that in a Kremlin press release, or certainly not regurgitated in our Western press. But all of those things are matter-of-factly happening. I will not say that it adds up to the immediate translation of hundreds of millions of people being mass resettled from South Asia to Siberia? No, it's not. But I want to be clear that we cannot hold equal today's present politics and pretend that it will not change while everything else is changing, because our politics will change. And you can see the politics of European countries also changing around immigration as a result of just de facto reality and their demographic shortages. And you can see that, again, Germany being a good case in point.
Parag, we have now sadly no time for more questions, but I'm just going to give the three members of the panel literally 1 minute each before I call upon Dr. Strachwitz to give the vote of thanks. So in the same sequence, and in reverse sequence from that which you spoke, David, Oscar, Sarah, 1 minute each as a wind up, one action maybe, or one recommendation. David. No sound.
Well, I have enjoyed the I'm unmuted.
Yeah, we.
I think everyone else can hear me.
Sorry, I can now.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Parag, for that. This has been a fascinating discussion. It seems to me that quite a lot is going to have to change, and I'm interested in whether that change is going to be a linear change over the next couple of decades as the planet heats up, or is it going to be exponential? And what are the cultural adaptations that are going to take place? Because, as you say, we have adapted in the past to fairly large scale mass migration. I guess that it will be different in different parts of the world, obviously. But I think our politicians have a long step before they get into that frame of mind, let us say.
Oscar.
Parag has taught us that the question how to decolonize has nothing to do with culture wars or wokeism, and everything to do with the real pressures and the real forces impacting on our time. So let us take that question seriously. Let us engage with the kinds of actions that would allow us to decolonize our minds and environs here in Europe and in the Americas. And in doing so, we will attest to the brilliancy of Parag's book.
Thank you, Sarah.
Very briefly, again, I've really enjoyed that, and I think I see clear parallels between where we are now and the development of the current system, you know, in that apex in the interwar years and then after the Second World War. But I think, it's kind of, you know, do we make a good job or a bad job of it? And I see it's one of the ways in which I think one could realistically make a good job of it is the types of rethinkings that we see about political franchises, where more and more states or sub-state levels are including migrants within people who live in their area in political decision making. Because I think the problem is that we have these political, like the political map and the map of where people are, and that the two are not cohering. So I would say that as just a minor route to where I do see some opportunity for immediate progress, I would see it on that. And in Scotland, again, we have seen some of that change in terms of extending the franchise to recognised refugees.
Thank you very much. I'm just holding up the book again because I do recommend the purchase and reading of it. It's an absorbing read and something to which one will go back on several occasions, I suspect. I'd now like, if I may, to call upon Dr. Strachwitz, if he can open up his sound and movie, to express the vote of thanks. I should perhaps say, just whilst he's coming on screen, that he's been kind enough to speak at one or two RSA events before, and indeed is speaking at the second of two forthcoming events on international cultural relations. Rupert.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be able to propose a vote of thanks. I've been racking my brain how to connect today's event to Burns Night, but I haven't come up with anything, so I can just make you all aware that it is coming up tonight. My thanks go first of all to Anne, of course, who organized and chaired today's event, and it's really been fantastic to have this discussion, and very timely too. And then, of course, my thanks go to Parag Khanna. I've known Parag for over 10 years when I first read his book on how to run the world, and I've quoted from it since in much of my writing. And I was always impressed how he got sort of civil society and the citizens into sort of the whole spectrum, which is sort of my field of activity. And the second thing that impressed me then, and that impressed me again today, was how positive his outlook was, because we have to read quite a lot on how terrible things are, how everything's going downhill, how the end of the world is near, so to speak. And reading Parag's book is extremely encouraging, because while, of course, he does say there's a lot of change in store for us, he's also saying that it's actually a good thing, and that we need to turn away from Theresa May's terrible quip on world citizens is actually something we should look forward to. And that is really a message that we urgently need, that the momentous change we're in for really spells for a good way of changing things, as long as we accept it properly. And so for that, and for a lot of other things that were mentioned today, thank you. Thank you also to the panelists. Each of you brought out specific, very important points that had to be mentioned and were mentioned. So what with everything, I do propose a vote of thanks for everybody who was active, including, of course, the staff of the RSA who set all this up. It's always quite difficult to set up something like this. I don't know where you are, Parag, at this very moment, but it's anyway across Europe and possibly even much further afield. So it's quite a challenge, and it's gone beautifully. Thank you, everybody. And as Anne was saying, there are events coming up which are worth seeing. There are two events on international cultural relations on 9th of February and the 9th of March. It's just slightly embarrassing to advertise them, because I'll be on the panel of one of them, but it was at Anne's special request that I'm doing it. So anyway, there's more to come and listen to at these events. And at the end of my proposal, thank you, Parag, again, for a very enlightening and encouraging talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. There is actually also an event on Thursday with John Alexander of the New Citizenship Project, talking about his future book, which will be published, I think, next month. So that's on the RSA website. So safe journeys, anybody who's traveling, and my thanks as well as Rupert's. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.